It started as a spin-off from Nokia, and after we got the funding, we were like, okay, then there's pressure to start delivering.
You came out and say, hey guys, now we are writing in Clojure.
Also, maybe it is still difficult to start with a REPL-based development. I think it's not for everybody. Could it have been rewritten in Clojure? I'm surprised that didn't even come up. It's not a democratic decision.
Can we say that Clojure and ClojureScript are completely two different languages?
You become a better developer if you learn multiple languages. Clojure is one tool that does it all.
Some organizations, they are moving towards from Clojure.
Clojure has spoiled all these other languages. It's very difficult to replace experience with anything but experience. You're painting a picture, and then when is that picture complete?
Would you take Clojure as one of the main technologies of the project right now in 2024? Hey guys, I'm Martin Barman, co-founder of Freshcode.
And I'm Vadim Kostyuk, Clojure Partnership Manager at Freshcode. And this is a podcast called Clojure in Product. Would you do it again?
And this is the limited podcast series that we decided to launch based on our prior experience in consultancy area and based on my experience of launching product in Clojure. And the main reason is that despite all language benefits and great features, we've seen the fewer products decided to choose Clojure as a main technical stack. And we decided to find the reason for that.
Yeah, and that is why we have decided to talk to tech leaders and see what our underlying causes may exist, what challenges they have faced during development and scaling, and the most important question, would they do it again if they would have a chance?
And that's why we decided to invite tech leaders from different products and industries that already use Clojure in their production and ask them several questions about their experience of running products in Clojure.
Yes, and our first guest is Kalle Korhonen. He is a chief product officer at the great company called Quuppa. Mm-hmm. So please tune in and share your experience with us.
Welcome. Let's start.
Hello, Kalle. We are pleased to have you on our podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Hello.
To our audience, I just want to tell a bit about Kalle. Kalle is a chief product officer at a well-known company called Quuppa. We would be pleased if you could tell a bit about Quuppa and what Quuppa does and where the Clojure fits in it.
Sure. All right. Quuppa does indoor positioning. Super interesting company. We're based in Finland, in Espoo. I had a long career in California, in Silicon Valley, but then I moved back. I'm originally Finnish. So indoor positioning. So what does that mean? We track these tags about the coin size a little thicker with these locators that we put on the ceiling. And then this is based on angle of arrival. Computationally heavy problem. The tag gives a signal, and then the locator measures the angle, but then that's all fed into this positioning system that computes the position. But for me, what makes Quuppa so interesting is that we do it all. That we do the firmware for the locators and the tags, as well as the algorithmic development for this Quuppa position engine, and then sort of the enterprise side where we manage systems and multiple sites for different large customers, whether they are in logistics or manufacturing or sports, or there's a whole lots of very, very different use cases for the technology.
Yeah, nice. I knew a lot about Quuppa before this meeting, but I believe a lot of our audience will find it interesting and will Google Quuppa afterwards to see more what it does. As far as we know, when you joined Quuppa, it was a primarily Java development team. And you mentioned that you were the one who brought Clojure into this ecosystem.
Yes. Yeah. So, Quuppa is not a new company. It started as a spin-off from Nokia, and the founders had already developed it. They are RF engineers. They had already developed that technology. But when I joined, Quuppa was still a very much like a research project. We did, site by site, whether it was again a sports arena or one warehouse at the time. But then when we started, we had a little bit of more funding as well. Shortly after I joined, we've always had sort of revenue based. But so we started working on this enterprise system, very much like solving the problem of remotely managing these systems. Position engine is typically deployed on the site, but it needs to be managed by us or a partner from outside, and we wanted to make software as a service, even though this has a very heavy physical hardware component. And then I had been kind of for different projects. I have quite some background with Clojure and Java, but Clojure was like two problems that we could immediately solve. That we're doing a lot of stuff over the wire, sending kind of instructions back and forth the network, and then collecting the position data. So kind of the serialization was like one of the aspects that really was like, really lucrative to me in Clojure. I knew that we had a very small team. So I was like, Clojure is the one tool that does it all, both the front end and back end. I've always liked the idea that I can kind of freely move from the back end to the front end and back again using more or less, it's of course not the same, but very sort of similar ideas in the whole technology stack.
I believe it was not easy.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. They were very interesting. So, like one of the core tenets was that, like, okay, we need to solve this problem for managing multiple sites, and we have this kind of the architecture is like a multiple monoliths. We have servers all around, and they're managed from a single interface. How do we even communicate to that server on the site? One of them is like, okay, there's a firewall in between, and then we use a WebSocket, but typically, of course, a WebSocket is from a browser to a server. But then, if you guys know Sente is this little abstraction layer over WebSockets in Clojure. My little contribution to that library was doing server to server or Java to server WebSockets instead of browser to a JVM server. And that's how we get past or we get through the customer's firewall. Obviously, they are always in sort of enterprise systems, and there's firewalls in between. But that's how we kind of establish the connection to the system that we try to manage. Many other problems, of course, as well. But that's one of the sort of the core architectural ideas in this.
And what was the size of a team of Java developers when you started to adopt Clojure?
Little by little, because we started with the idea, and then it was first me, and then I was like, okay, somehow I was able to convince the board and the management that like, well, this is the right architecture. But then we hired a few guys. I always wanted to have the experience in house, but at the same time, especially after we got the funding, we were like, okay, then there's pressure to kind of start delivering. So we were lucky enough we had a couple of consultants from Metosin, which is this Finnish Clojure focused consulting company. And they were really good. It was fun to work with them, but nobody can kind of, or I don't know, at least we couldn't afford to keep them a long time. But they were crucial in that period when we built a whole lot of software, sort of greenfield development.
And what kind of work did they do? So did they do training of a Java team or just technical and architecture part?
All kinds, really. Sometimes, of course, training, even UI development. Of course, many of the architectural parts, and there's always this other part. It's not quite enough to just develop the software, but it's all of like, okay, so how do we deliver it? What's the whole deployment pipeline? They did many of those parts as well.
And how the internal team reacted to your suggestion? So how this happened actually? You came out and say, "Hey guys, now we're writing in Clojure," or
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. So that's interesting. So like the core of it, and or at least the algorithm core is in Java. But
Mhm.
for the Clojure development, we hired new developers mostly. I mean, we were also at the time when the team was expanding, and I was lucky enough that I had sort of the
Mhm.
freedom to decide where are we going to expand. Overall, Quuppa is sort of so complex. There's firmware, there's the algorithm development, there's all these different parts and a lot of testing systems. There's Python, there's lots of bash scripts and stuff. So it was not
Mhm.
introducing one more language that runs on the JVM. It's like, okay, well, I don't know it, but that's fine.
Pretty interesting way of transferring. So right now, Java engineers are still working in Java, or they kind of learning Clojure or doing some
Java
stuff.
engineers are still, the kind of the hardcore is still in Java,
Mhm.
and of course, could it have been rewritten in Clojure? Yes, probably. Any sort of sufficiently large architecture, like you gotta be
Mhm.
careful that you don't break everything because, of course, it's like,
Yeah.
if we had known, we would have made it better, but you never know, and then you have to be careful that you don't introduce different kinds of bugs or problems. Like we get a whole lot with Clojure, but we try to kind of build it sort of honoring the existing code base.
Would you take Clojure as one of the main technologies of the project right now in 2024?
Any day, yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, for us it was easy because the sort of the web parts were like undeveloped or old. They were like very based on very old sort of servlet technology.
Mhm.
Not necessarily even Spring or anything. So it was very easy for me to just rip off the sort of the servlets, replace that
Mhm.
part with Clojure. But that's a small thing. I think the benefit really is more about especially in our environment in this kind of network based development.
I would say that I know technology not only when I know how to do some stuff in it, but when I know the limitations of the technology or drawbacks of technology. So, can you name some problems or drawbacks that you faced during this adoption?
Yeah, I mean the nature of like a sort of network developed that you're managing state in multiple places. That makes it
Mm.
difficult. And then of course Clojure that you gotta know. Like Clojure, maybe it is still difficult to start with, and there's a lot of different ways and new ways of like,
Mhm.
okay, well this was done, then we've already moved on to CLJ new or whatever, like from laning in, and there's a lot of stuff.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
then sort of the REPL based development, I don't know. I think it's not for everybody.
Mm.
Sometimes it's like, so like, hey, like you can actually, how do you debug a system that's running? And that's okay. You just hook up your REPL to it and start doing it. But it's like, for others, it's like, wait a minute, I can't do that. Or there's like, but I'm used to doing
Mhm.
this or that.
That part is really interesting because REPL is the first thing when I say about something about Clojure.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, totally. Debugging and knowing how to read, especially ours, is like, still there's a lot of like, okay, where was the bug? Was it in the Java code,
Mhm.
in the core, or was it in the
Mhm.
Clojure code? And that's not always immediately obvious. That makes it, of
Mhm.
course, because this is not a pure Clojure system, that makes it perhaps at times more complex.
I talk a lot with different projects and teams who use Clojure, and nowadays I see that some organizations they are moving towards from Clojure actually because of different reasons. And I wanted to ask you: have you ever seen the moves within your organizations in Quuppa? And maybe someone pushed the decision to move forward from Clojure, or even maybe ever considered this.
Yeah, I mean, our current developers, our Clojure developers, I picked them so like, so which plugins do you prefer? And it's like, if you if you prefer Clojure, then you're good. Maybe everybody has a favorite language, and his favorite language was Go. And it's like, okay, maybe we should develop this with Go. And I'm like, no, we're not gonna do that because we already picked the language, and you can't for different things. That's like you gotta move forward. You make that decision and then move on with that. It's not that I'm even trying to hammer Clojure everywhere, but for this technology, there was no room to just change to something else. I don't know. I see it, of course, like and Clojure as a sort of in the industry. There's always people that's like, oh well, maybe there should be an even better language. I'm quite happy with the ones who are sort of experienced with Clojure. Oftentimes you hear from them that hey, Clojure has spoiled all these other languages because it is consistent and works nicely, and there's not a whole lot of new things or new syntax coming in.
I'm a bit curious about, culture of doing technical decisions in your company. So have you arranged architect committee, discuss everything? How usually, you said one guy suggested to move to another language, but you rejected this. But how Clojure ended up in being implemented? So
yeah, I mean, I can say that it was not a democratic decision. It was a decision that I pretty much took and sort of convinced those that needed to be convinced. I mean, Quuppa is still a small company. We're less than 50 people, so and much less engineers. So we're like, the decision making is still very sort of agile. There's not a whole lot of committee meeting, and there's, of course, because the technology stack is big, there's a lot of people who are specialized in different areas. So no, we didn't have any architectural board or anything.
I want to ask you about overengineering, because I've seen this tendency in different Clojure projects, especially that were started by people that are not really into Clojure way of thinking. They were curious about Clojure. They decided to start the project in Clojure, but they are not really understand their whole philosophy. And I've seen sometimes tendency to build, domain-specific languages. So we're not building the system. We're building domain-specific language, and then we build system in this language. Have you met something like this in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of libraries, but and maybe Clojure more that you have just have another domain-specific language. But I think that happens all the time. I think partly, it's the fun of creating and laziness to read other people's code and understanding, how do the pieces fit together. I'm not sure that that's a sort of a Clojure specific problem. But yeah, so over-engineering, of course, at the architecture level can be fatal. I've always been sort of against that, especially this thing that I've seen microservices architectures gone really bad because you just, without thinking, you split everything into different services, and it really doesn't buy you anything but added complexity.
You don't connect this to Clojure specifically, yeah? This 10.
I wouldn't. No, I would not say that. I've seen some libraries, but perhaps the beauty of the Clojure is still that the many libraries tend to be very small, and then you end up with lots of different libraries. But there are few more perhaps on the Java side that you have these overarching frameworks that try to dictate Spring that, hey, this is it, and then you have a different Spring library for every little thing.
How do you use Clojure? As a set of functions and small libraries, or do you use some frameworks that actually exist in Clojure world?
If you just talk about specific frameworks, it's at least Reframe. So we are React region based, and there are different alternatives, but I think at least Reagent is it's the better React, or it feels more natural. But anyway, so Reframe and send the API interface is the method signature is very similar. So, and the programming model is very similar. If you kind of use them, sort of, you have this inner loop of like reframe events from the sort of your local backend to the front end, and then you can kind of extend that to the WebSocket to your server. That kind of pattern or programming model we use extensively. Just to name some others, Integrant, just to kind of boot up the systems. I think it's just quite nice. Nothing to complain about it. There's plenty of libraries, but not sort of main frameworks, I guess.
You said used Integrant, so you are not using
No,
it
we
right now?
use it. We use it.
You use
Yeah,
it.
I think we very early on. I started with Mount, and then we moved on to Integrant.
I see. And do you find it helpful for a team to use this kind of frameworks?
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that I don't know. At least in this, like everybody's like, oh yeah, Integrant. Okay, I'm good with that.
I see.
Speaking of technologies, I've been listening carefully to what you've been saying, and I've been comparing it to what I've heard from other teams. And what I realized that each Clojure project is unique. Basically, there is no like two projects that can be like in a totally similar even stack. We're always talking about some differences because on one project we have one technical lead that made his own decisions, and there is another one. So I was wondering, is it something that you consider when you're looking for team members? So when you mentioned that you were looking for Clojure engineers, was it important for you that this Clojure engineer will be like covering, let's say, 90% of your technical stack? Or you were primarily looking at the willingness to work with all the stack that you have?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a good, interesting question. Yeah, and of course, all the projects are very unique because they do very different things, and maybe if it's to sort of web development, they perhaps they're kind of the tools and choices tend to be sort of more similar. But what I was looking for in engineers, of course, it was primarily first and foremost, it was the interest in Clojure. That like, hey, do you want to build it with this? Because I know that there's less that works for small companies, works both for and against. That it's difficult to find engineers, but I could find, like, at least in Clojure, I can find people who are really interested in working with Clojure and they're looking for Clojure projects. So it was easier to sell in that respect. Screening is like I go through, like, I name libraries. Hey, do you know this? Do you know that? So to get sort of a picture of what you've done with Clojure, because if you don't know the kind of the main libraries there's so many that like I can immediately see that, like, hey, you're interested in Clojure, but you don't have the experience. But it didn't really matter otherwise for me. And then of course there's the other part of this is like, hey, have you ever, like, to me it's interesting that not many people, even like if you've always done web development, like you've never even used sort of UDP or like done any like sort of perhaps a little bit lower level network programming. This was specific to our system, but and then it's one other thing, especially again specific to Quuppa, not for many other companies, is like, hey, are you interested in hardware? Because like again, like when I said in the beginning, it's like that part is like still fascinating to me. That there's so many things that we work with, like we work directly with hardware, whereas many sort of, if you work on a sort of a software as a service company, you may never see the hardware. You just deploy to cloud, but you never really, like, the hardware is never sort of visible to you.
Yeah, that's interesting point of view. I was asking because when we were talking with different partners from all over the globe, criteria for senior engineers, they were so different that we just couldn't match them. For some project, senior engineer is just someone who's been working with Clojure, let's say for 7 years, even though it was pure Clojure and ClojureScript. like no additional leaps and frameworks. And just some of the projects were considering such engineers junior because they don't know much about Reframe or Reagent, or I don't know, for someone, Mali is like, let's say, the key point to know. That's why it was interesting to hear. What is your opinion on it?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that like it's very difficult to replace experience with anything but experience. So of course, if you've worked with the multiple languages and you have a sort of a deeper understanding, I think at least my view, and I'm sure many share that, like that you're much more well-rounded. It's easier to like learn another language. It's like maybe in some ways you become a better developer if you learn multiple languages the same way as it's easier for you to learn. If you know already a few different languages, it's easier for you to pick up a new language, sort of just a spoken language. The same way you can kind of learn. But, like you said, there's lots of different kinds of skills and skilled engineers, and they can all be good in very different ways.
Yeah, can you tell me a bit more about structure of a team? So how do you separate front end and backend engineering? So or you have everyone is full stack and everyone can do both low level UDP packet inspection and both React.
I like to think that, but of course, and I think that's more that like people sort of are lazy and like to specialize quickly. I encourage that, like, hey, if you're more into just like writing the front end, and many of the backend engineers like, wait a minute, I said like, I don't know what to do, and then it's, so then like, so like I need to know exactly how the UI looks like so that I could implement it. And it's not necessarily, if you've never worked on it, it's not that easy to, okay, so do I try to find a bootstrap component, slap a little bit of ClojureScript on it, or do I just write it from scratch, or what should I do? It's not that, but I like to kind of like at least sort of do kind of pair programming and code reviews, so you have an understanding of like, okay, so when something fails, you can at least start looking into it. I totally understand that people have a kind of different interest and specialty, so it's not like I try to intentionally force them to kind of move up and down the stack.
I'm asking because sometimes when we try to hire a ClojureScript person, the main thing they should know is not ClojureScript, but React.
Yeah.
And that's the main pain point, actually, because sometimes person can know ClojureScript, write Clojure, know everything, but have very limited knowledge of React and life cycles and everything. Yeah. So have you faced such problems?
Yes, absolutely. And there can be very different Clojure engineers. Like if they come from a Java background, they often come sort of a more back-end experience. And but the front-end engineers may not know anything about JVM, but they might know some other sort of more perhaps front-end inclined, like technology, Python or Node.js, or just JavaScript. And of course, there's a huge difference on the front end. If you know multiple languages, and it's good to kind of know under the hood, like just plain JavaScript and how that works and how do the browsers work. Just picking up for a backend engineer, again, just picking up like something like, okay, so how does CSS work? It's a completely new ballgame.
So can we say that Clojure and ClojureScript are completely two different languages, ecosystems? I don't know.
We can say that they're different ecosystems, but I mean, I don't know. We have a lot of crossover code, and again, maybe it's because of the sort of the network nature of the development. But certainly, and that's another great benefit, that like we can have this. It's the same language, and now we use it on the front end, now we use it on the back end. So certainly not exactly the same. There's a lot of tricks that but it's not the language itself. But when you cross over to Java, so like hey, this is how I'm gonna use the Java this and that, or the same way in JavaScript. They're like, hey, no, I will drop down because I know that there's you can do it in JavaScript in this or that way. That's where the differences will certainly come from.
I'm wondering, like you said, ClojureScript is more tricky in terms of like you should have some background in React, or at least some familiarity. And maybe it's obvious question, but still, is it harder for you to onboard people on the backend more or on the front end more? And is it hard to even find someone that is willing to work on the front end? I'm asking primarily because in my experience, most of Clojure engineers, they tend to choose backend as their field of expertise, just because they don't want to polish some bottoms, dealing with styling and this kind of stuff. When we're looking for, let's say, full stack engineer, normally it's a person that is really, really good in backend, but for the front end, not that this person cannot do front end, it's just this person doesn't want to do. So is it hard for you to maintain basically the front end on a ClojureScript from that perspective?
I don't know. I mean, of course, there's always a lot of things to do in the front end. Once you get your algorithm done, and it can just kind of keep working for years, and you don't have to change it. But it's so different. Like typically, kind of backend is like, if you write to a database and it's like it has to be right. Whereas on the front end, it's like, well, now I made the UI this way, but you could still make it that way, or we can make a million other changes. But like, what's good enough? Very different, because it's like UI is like, sometimes it's like you're painting a picture, and then when is that picture complete? Is it harder to find? I don't know. Like at least right now we have such a great team. I'm like super happy with them. So they have of course, their own strengths. Some on the back end, some on the front end. But it's not like I've hired hundreds or even tens of Clojure engineers. So I don't know like how it's like, statistically what's more difficult to find.
I'm curious from the list of questions that we've already asked you about Clojure in production, your experience. Maybe you can name some question that we should have asked, but haven't actually. Maybe something important that we haven't asked you.
You should totally ask about the IDEs. I'm surprised that didn't even come up. I've been in this business for a long time, and I've started with Eclipse. I still use Eclipse, and now it's like I use as many IDEs as I use browsers. I have like different browser for everything. So now I also have different IDEs. Like I use Eclipse and IntelliJ, VS Code as well, and they all have like their different strengths. But I'm still not so sure like what's the sort of the best environment. I don't know if I even care about the best environment anymore. But I'm always willing to kind of try out and experiment, and I'd be interested to also know like what other people nowadays use. Like I haven't followed much of that.
And are you trying to manage this IDEs culture in your team, or everyone just choose whatever he wants?
Yeah, everybody chooses their own. Like I long ago let go of that. Like it's just like you pick your laptop, whatever you're comfortable with, and we meet at the sort of like, as long as your commits are good, and then of course the review interface is normally then in GitLab or GitHub, and then sort of that's the common denominator, not the IDE.
And do you think that IDE or tooling support and Clojure lack some things that are required or very important?
I don't know. A few years ago, it was like all about especially on the like, what is your build system? Like, there's like seemed to be like this struggle between laning and boot and CLJ, and like now I think that's more settled. Maybe we sort of Clojure as a community also lost some because of that, because it's like, really yet another tool. Why do I need to pick up that? I'm happy to try out different things, even if I don't try to force it on. We are still sort of laning it based, and I'm good with that. Like for me, it's like, like I can do something on the side, and maybe for the new project, I have at least one new good, very interesting projects. But there I'm okay. Like, let's use the new tools.
Do you have some plans to move in from Leiningen in production?
I'd be happy to use different tools for different projects. I would not go back. I mean, now it's done this way. We also kind of sort of the Java parts are, and Java still sort of in terms of lines of code is quite a bit bigger. It uses Maven, so Maven and Leiningen maybe is sort of style-wise are closer. Not pun intended. So that's fine. Those tools are okay, but I wouldn't resist if for a new project we would use CLJ.
Yeah, I was wondering whether you use any within the Quuppa any domain specific languages.
No, not really. And you should also know that my background, my history in especially university is in domain-specific modeling and domain-specific languages, and especially on the kind of the visual languages. Like, I know that part is always interesting to me, but for this thing, and that's maybe worth a different podcast. But no, not we don't really use any specific DSLs, and we haven't kind of stepped towards any of that direction. Like, we don't have that sort of concise, compact domain where we make variations or like, we just need to make some part. It's just sort of I don't know, straight up organic development.
We really ran out of the questions, Clay. You answered everything we hoped for. And here is the part when I would like to ask you to leave the question for the next guest who will be on our podcast. Can you please, you can ask anything you'd like to.
Totally ask questions like, so what is your experience with AI, and have you used sort of any of the AI with Clojure, and whether it's, tool support or where, anywhere else. I'm exploring that space as well. So it's very interesting to me.
Very interesting question. Okay.
It really is. It really is. I believe this question actually requires another series of podcasts.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like I keep getting disappointed with the current versions, but I'm like, okay, maybe there's something there. But every time I try to use like current versions of the ChatGPT or Claude or like one of those, and it's like, well, that was not a good answer. But I remain hopeful.
If you're curious, I can tell you about my experience with AI and my research in this field. So actually, I found out that, straight up usage of AI, like write a program that do stuff and earn money, doesn't work. But it works pretty well if you supply a lot of context in it. And, providing a database schema, style of the code, and a lot of other stuff, and detailed specification. And only after you ask a rather simple question. And in this way, it can gather all this context information and, produce some valuable result. I actually have a pretty good article about this. The guys who are building front-end generation in React based on Figma. So they use ChatGPT a lot. And they said that naive approach doesn't work well. But when they extract a lot, they build a structure, kind of DSL for AI, and they feed this DSL to AI and ask some questions. It works pretty well. So I envision the next step of services that will use AI internally, that they will not show anything at all to the end user, but they generate some stuff based on the context. And Apple is doing such thing because they provide in what is on the screen, what applications is opened, what's written in this application. And without this context, AI is not usable.
Yeah, I mean, it mirrors my experience as well. Yes, that helps, of course. And then asking very specific questions, but and sometimes in, especially UI programming, it can still kind of make it faster. But those are like simple things. But the complex things are, of course, I'm interested in, and it's just like, sort of falls flat on an understanding what some code base is about. Even sometimes I end up spending more time explaining the problem as like, hey, I could have just solved this problem on my own.
That's true. That's true. Maybe, a combination of DSLs, domain-specific modeling, and AI will be much better because it's limit the space of output for
Yes,
answering.
I agree. That could be very interesting. Yes.
Okay, we will think. I think it would be curious to ask another guy.
Thank you very much, Kalle. It was truly an amazing talk. I myself enjoyed it so much. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's great.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.